Brian Kemp suspending the Hall County Sheriff for another 30 days. Sheriff Gerald Couch was suspended for 60 days back in March after he was arrested for DUI while driving his department SUV. Those 60 days would have been up tomorrow. Our Savannah Levins has been following this case since the first suspension. And Savannah, you've been really digging into this. This is quite an ongoing saga at this point. Tell us what you know.
Yeah, so, this whole situation is really unique because, you have a police officer or a police chief who gets into trouble and his or her department can fire her, right? Mm-hmm. But sheriffs are constitutional officers. Mm-hmm. They're elected, so they can't be fired.
Right.
So that, brings the question, when there is suspected wrongdoing or alleged criminal activity, what happens? Well, the answer goes back to Georgia code, in which the governor essentially has to step in, and what the governor is able to do under Georgia law is appoint a committee to investigate, and that committee is made up of the attorney general and two sheriffs that they appoint from the Sheriff's Association. Just can't be in the same county, obviously.
Right.
So Governor Kemp went ahead in this case, after the Hall County Sheriff, Sheriff Couch, was arrested for DUI, went ahead and appointed that committee. The committee recommended suspension, and so the governor, as you mentioned, issued that suspension, which under Georgia law is 60 days. So we follow up today, and we're like, it's
what's
the last
on?
day,
Yep.
What's the decision? Because from there, that investigative period allows the governor to either, remove that sheriff from office entirely, reinstate them, depending the outcome. So we followed up and we said, what's going on? I said, funny you should reach out. We just issued the executive order, essentially extending the suspension for 30 days, which is also allowable under this law. Now, it's the last extension that's allowable. It's pretty tight deadlines under this Georgia code, the 60 days plus a potential additional 30 days. And they do that obviously because, well, right now Hall County doesn't have a city. I mean,
Right.
Technically it's Sheriff Couch, but you don't want to keep a community with no leading sheriff for too long. So that's why these kind of dates are built in. So we're going to see what happens after that 30 days. Now, we do know, of course, and what could have led to or contributed to this extension is the fact that Sheriff Couch was recently arrested again for failure to maintain lane and issues with driving on his, license, which was kind of provisional. His lawyer says that there was confusion with the Department of Driver Services, that he was not driving drunk. But, that was a new wrench thrown in the last couple weeks that could have caused the governor's office to say, all right, let's extend this a little bit longer.
So go back to the initial incident. Can you walk people through what happened, what led to this whole thing?
Yeah, so it was early in the morning. I don't have it in front of me. I want to say it was 9 a.m.-ish. And he was pulled over. Sheriff Couch was pulled over because one of his deputies noted that he was kind of swerving a little bit. Pulled him over, realized it was the sheriff in the county-issued vehicle. They had to call in state troopers because, if you pull over someone in your own agency, that's standard protocol, just to make sure that everything's above board. So they call in state trooper. We read the reports from the troopers who say that he admitted to drinking. The sheriff said he had four locos starting at 6 a.m. that morning. And then he did, again, I don't have it in front of me, but he did blow higher than the legal limit. I think it was about 2 times the legal limit. So he was arrested. So that was the initial arrest that kind of set all of this off. Now, I did an investigation, I don't know if you recall, about police officers getting DUIs. It's not uncommon or unprecedented at all. And in fact, a lot of times people keep their jobs for getting a DUI. Now, the other layer to this, Caitlin, is this could all be moot if his post certification is revoked.
Right.
So Post has its own investigation ongoing, and I interviewed Chris Harvey, the director of Georgia Post, which is the Post Police Officer Standards and Training Council. Basically oversees, for those who don't know, the certifications that police officers need to have to hold positions in law enforcement. And so when these police officers would get a DUI, Post opens its own certification or its own investigation, as it does for any suspected criminal activity, to decide whether, to suspend their certification, to require, some maybe additional training, to revoke it entirely. And they are, we know and have confirmed, investigating in this case with Sheriff Couch. Now, if they decide to revoke his certification, governor's investigation doesn't really matter because he can't hold office anyway. He can't be a sheriff if he doesn't have a post certification. So separately and differently from the governor's standard operating procedure, post does not have that same kind of timeline.
Oh, interesting.
So they have a little more time to do, its investigation. So unclear now whether post might make a decision before this, 30 days are up, that the clock starts today, or if they're kind of waiting to see what the governor's office comes up with, and if they decide to suspend him permanently.
Have you heard anything from the sheriff? Has he issued any statements or said anything about this?
Through his lawyer, he has legal representation who after the first DUI arrest, or the first arrest, which was a DUI, I should say, said that, they asked people to refrain from judgment, wait for all the facts to come out. And after this second arrest with the failure to maintain lane and the license issue, really put a lot of blame on DDS for not communicating properly about the license limitations. And so, they're maintaining his innocence. I asked if he plans to resign at all, because, of course, that too is an option.
Right.
If you feel like you don't have the support of a community that is going to have to reelect you eventually, you could step down. He does not have, as far as his lawyer says, any intention of doing that at this time.
And I know DDS also kind of clapped back too. They issued a very
clap back.
strangely strong statement about this.
Yeah, the Department of Driver Services said, we couldn't be more clear about what the limitations are. We still don't know exactly what happened there, what the provisions on his license were exactly. Now, I will say, going back to Post and their investigations, we did this longer investigation about how often police officers who are arrested for DUI, even convicted of DUI, have their post certifications revoked. And I mentioned it's very infrequent. There are a few of the hundreds, I think it was 305 years, something like that, arrests. Of all of those, there were a handful of law enforcement officers who had their post certifications revoked. And in those cases, there were kind of, extra circumstances. Okay. For instance, one that comes to mind is a police officer was driving to work in his patrol vehicle, hit a mailbox, left, found out later that he was under the influence. So Post said, well, not only were you driving under the influence, but you lied about it, you fled a scene, and you were in your police vehicle. Now, that makes me think about this case because, Sheriff Couch was in his county-issued vehicle when he was arrested for this DUI. I wouldn't be surprised, Caitlin, if Post revokes his certification for that.
Wow. And you said they don't have the same timeline, though. So the governor has extended this investigation or suspension for 30 more days, but Post can kind of issue their recommendation whenever.
Yeah, I reached out to Chris Harvey, the director of Post, just to clarify that, but I did read the statute and the law, and, when you read the statute about the governor's investigation, it very explicitly lines out that 60 days with the 30-day extension. The law that carves out this investigative process for Post does not mention any sort of mandated timeline. Aside from, obviously, there's a statute of limitations for any crime. Post can't revoke someone's certification necessarily for something that happened 20 years ago. Obviously, that's not going to be the case here regardless.
So in 30 days, one way or the other, we're going to know something.
Yes, we should. We should know something. And I was looking up recent cases where the governor has done this. The Towns County Sheriff was suspended by the governor's office for 60 days, and then that suspension was upheld. They never ended up extending it. Now, in Towns County, he wasn't facing any felonies, so that part is kind of similar, but it was assault and battery, kind of some concerns there. So that one wasn't extended, and the suspension was upheld pending what happens with the criminal case, right? Because everyone's, presumed innocent until found guilty. The governor's office, 60 to 90 days is not enough time to actually find out whether someone's going to be convicted of something or not. That indictment actually ended up just getting overturned. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. But there's a lot that goes into this. So yes, to your point, in 30 days, we should have some sort of answer, but it might very well be similar to that where they say, pending the outcome, if these charges are overturned, he could return to office.
Fascinating. Yeah. I know this takes a lot of checking and reading the statute and understanding how these things work. So thank you so much for your expertise in this. I think it's really important. Appreciate you.